Like the Arabian Nights, eclipse of the Sunnis, full of the author's own Iraqi, Syrian, Jordanian, and Lebanese nights of investigations and encounters and discoveries, is at heart a book of stories. And the fact, as you'll see, that Deborah has the true storyteller's gift makes this book, as evocative as it is insightful, as dramatic as it is revealing, her gift to us all. Deborah Amos was a Nieman Fellow back in 1991 and 92, no doubt exploring the souks and alleys of Cambridge the way she would those of Baghdad and Damascus. Now, we cannot offer the same excitements, mysteries, and dangers those cities do, only our delight at having her back. So do join me in giving Deborah a warm welcome now to the Harvard COOP.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you very much. So, when I was negotiating on your behalf, here's what I hope happens this evening. I will tell you about my book, but what I hope is that we have a conversation rather than a lecture, because Iraq is hard, and so is the Middle East. And I've tried to make it a little easier in these pages. And I'm thank you very much for recognizing that. And I think that we are turning our attention to Iraq again because there's been another election. And in Washington, there's been a great deal of congratulations for ourselves and for the Iraqis. Because it is said in Washington that we didn't know who was going to win, and that's a good thing. That we have brought democracy to Iraq, and the Iraqis have embraced it. But I have to tell you that it doesn't look that way in Arab eyes, not at all. This is not the shining example of what democracy should be for this region, because in fact, Iraqis continue to flee their homes. And those who have managed to settle outside Iraq have no intention of returning unless they are forced. Their dream isn't to bask in this new democracy, but it is to stay put for as long as they can. Try to find a way to get to Australia or Canada or Sweden, or if they have to, come to the United States. And I say that because they arrive to a broken refugee system here. And if short of that, to find a way to survive in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt. Because inside Iraq, unemployment is now at about 40%. Al-Qaeda has reemerged again. Over just the past week, there's been 3 horrific attacks. It's a very troubling time there, very troubling. And it's fragile at the exact moment when most Americans have really turned their attention away from Iraq and have started paying attention, if they do at all, to Afghanistan. So I think this book has come out at a very important time because we aren't finished there yet. We will have another 2 years of troops on the ground, and what we've brought to Iraq and what we leave behind is an incredibly important legacy. In my introduction, you heard that I'm a storyteller, and I was pleased to hear in the introduction that that's how it reads, because that was my intention. What I wanted to do was write a narrative book. I wanted to tell stories because Iraq is so complex and the terminology is hard to understand. I know, because I've been doing this for 25 years and I've had to not dumb it down, but try to make it simple for audiences who don't watch it every day like I do. And this book, I think, is filled with all the tools that I learned over those 25 years to figure out how to make it simple, how to make it compelling. I want to start by explaining to you why I would call the book The Eclipse of the Sunnis. The idea that it raises musical questions, and some people, others say, oh yeah, I can remember that, Eclipse of the Sun. Yeah, I can go look that up. That's great for Americans. And when you look at the title page, that cover, you see an Arab man. He's in his white kafia. He's got his igal on. And for most Americans, that's enough. He's an Arab. He's looking a little leery. But that title, for a Middle East audience and for Middle Easterners, is as frank as a slap in the face. It makes people wince. when I tell them that this is the name of my book. And I have joked with friends that it wouldn't survive for 10 minutes in a glass bookshop with a big glass window in Beirut or in Cairo or in Amman or even Baghdad. It's hard to tell you what a equivalent of that would be. Maybe it would be the eclipse of the people who always ran everything. But still, you wouldn't get the emotional impact of why Middle Easterners take such umbrage at that book. And in fact, the man who has been very helpful to me in the Syrian embassy to give me my visas, when he knew what I was going to call the book, he said, "I'm going to lose my job." And he meant it. He was terrified that simply the association with me and that title, he was going to get fired. And there's a reason for that. There was a time in Syria in the 1980s when an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood felt that they were eclipsed. And they fought back. And at that moment in time in Syria, they almost brought the country to a civil war. So that phrase has very, very deep meaning to Middle Easterners. Arabs want to know, who is that guy? Are you talking about Saudi Arabia? Are you talking about just Iraq? Is he an Iraqi? And the reason that they ask this question is because for centuries, Sunni Muslims have been the majority in the Middle East. They are the Middle East in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Lebanon, although in the next day or two that could change because the Shias are actually moving into the majority there. There's a handful of them in Jordan. There's only one country in the Middle East outside of Bahrain where Shias are a majority, an aggrieved majority, and that is in Iraq. And it's unusual that the numbers are this way in Iraq, but that is the demography of the country. And what has happened since 2003 is, for the first time ever, these Arab Shias have been put in a leadership position, and we did that. The U.S. invasion of Iraq, for the first time, catapulted Arab Shias to rule a country. It hasn't happened before in history. And so what this book is about, and what this story is about power and not religion. Although we do call it the eclipse of the Sunnis. And by choosing the title, that's what I wanted to highlight. Because I think in some ways it does get missed in the narrative about Iraq. I think about it all the time when I'm trying to explain to myself what's going on there. We empowered our Shiites. We swept aside the political order in the Middle East because Sunnis dominate almost all the other governments in the region. And so what happened in this invasion of ours is that we set this divide alight across the region. You feel it in almost every country in the region, whether they have Shiites or not. Again, this is principally about power and not about religion. And it happens when an Arab army topples a Sunni tyrant. And the region really has not settled since. And it is about the Sunni-Shia divide that makes people so uncomfortable. Now, it was Iraqi civilians who paid the highest price for the invasion. They paid the highest price for 3 decades of Saddam. When I would go around and interview the refugees, the principal figures in my book, almost everybody had an account of kidnapping, of torture, of extortion, of rape, death threats that forced them to head for the borders, and they were running for their lives. And I'm going to read you a blogger who wrote about when it was his turn to leave, when he just didn't think he could stay in Iraq and survive any longer. And what he writes is, "One of my friends keeps berating me about how I should love this country, this land of my ancestors, where I was born and raised, how I should be grateful and return to the place that gave me everything. And I always tell him the same thing. Iraq, as you and I once knew it, is lost. What's left of it, I don't want." By 2007, Iraqis were leaving the country at a rate of about 4,000 a day. Then 1 in 6 Iraqis had become a refugee or had become displaced. If you think about the equivalent numbers for an American population, that would have been 50 million men, women, and children. It was 20% of Iraq's pre-war population. The corollary to understand what is happening there today is this statistic, and that is, of those people who left, 60% of them are Sunni Arabs. 60%. They were a little bit more than 20% of the population before the war. 60% of the exiles are Sunnis. 15% are Christians. They were less than 3% before the war. There's a mix in this exile population. There are Mandeans, people who revere John the Baptist. All of their ceremonies are done in running water. There's Yazidis, secular Shiites. There's some Kurds. There's families from mixed marriages. But what I wanted to write about, what I think is missing in Iraq coverage, is the notion that these exiles are part of this unresolved sectarian divide, this power divide in Iraq. And many of them stay outside of the country, not because Iraq is unsafe, although it's becoming unsafe again in the last couple of weeks. These Sunnis are in touch with their relatives back home, the ones who couldn't or didn't leave or lived in a safer neighborhood. These relatives tell them that they feel deeply insecure. They're largely excluded from power at almost every level. And what they're waiting for is this Shiite-dominated government to show signs of political reconciliation. That's what the surge was supposed to produce, but it didn't. And so I argue that these refugees raise a fundamental question about Iraq's identity. For them, there are plenty of reasons not to go home. As I told you, the Sunnis are waiting for a place in the country. Iraqis who worked for the Americans are waiting for the death lists to disappear. The secular exiles are waiting to be sure that Iraq doesn't turn into an Islamic state. And couples in mixed marriages want to know that it's okay for a Sunni and a Shia to marry each other across that sectarian divide. In pre-war 2003 in Baghdad, nobody talked about mixed marriages. Iraqis married each other, and they didn't really ask Sunni or Shiite. It was a secular country then. This became almost a crime after 2003 when the sectarian divide hit Baghdad hard. Marriages broke up, families separated over this very question. The other problem is most of these exiles have been kicked out of their houses by militias. When there was ethnic and sectarian cleansing in Baghdad, how it was usually accomplished is that you would get a knock on the door, you would be given an hour to leave the house, you could pack whatever you could manage to get out in an hour, and another family of a different from a different sect would be moved into your house. Those people are still there today. There are 1 million houses in Baghdad in dispute. And to be able to move back in would require the army to help you get the family out and the police to protect you if you were going to stay in your house. I was in Baghdad in 2009, and the formerly mixed neighborhoods where Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds and Christians and Yazidis and Mandeans all lived together. That's over. Those neighborhoods are now pretty much one thing or the other thing. You can be the wrong kind of Muslim in a neighborhood these days in Baghdad. And so many of these exiles say to me what they're afraid of is that Iraq has been transformed into something that they don't recognize and they don't want. And until they see some sign, they aren't going home. Here's something else to know about these refugees. They are predominantly from the middle class. These are the teachers, the doctors, the television producers, the artists, the architects, the surgeons, the entrepreneurs of the country. And these are the very people that Iraq is going to need to rebuild. And they are disproportionately Sunni. So without reconciliation, without security, without political reconciliation, they're not going back. So this is the political science part of the book. And now I want to tell you about some of the stories that are unfold in this book. I want to give context so the next couple of stories I tell make some sense. I did a narrative treatment. I have food, sex, television. I tried to find things that were recognizable in American culture. So you can ask the question, what would I do? Who would I be? Because you can rest assured that Iraqis do share your aspirations, and the way that what they want for their kids is the same. And I also put a lot of humor in this book. because I wanted to show that there are people who make the best of a bad situation. So here are some of the stories that I tell in the book, and the first one I want to share is about Iraqi Christians. Iraqi Christians were the first to leave Iraq. They kind of were the canary in the coal mine, and because they had no friends. Christians don't have militias. They were about 3% of the country. They're probably one of the oldest Christian communities on earth. They are descendants from the first Christian empire in the Middle East. And their crime was, as Iraq began to descend into chaos and Islamists began to stalk the streets, they were seen as supporters of the West because of their Christianity. And at the same time, there were Christian missionaries that were coming in with American tanks, and it proved everything Al-Qaeda said about them. And so by 2004, there were a string of bombings across the country, and it was targeting these Christian churches. And they were wealthy enough so that they could get out, and many of them did, because there are Christian communities that took them in Syria, in Jordan, in Beirut, even in Egypt. So they did have a place to go. And they felt, I think, early on, that they would get preferential treatment for resettlement. Turned out not to be true, and they waited for as long as everybody else. But those were their reasons. So the story that I have always been astonished by happens in Mosul in 2006. And Mosul is the site of an old Christian empire, and so this is these Christians have deep roots in their community, and they were under incredible attack. And there's a Chaldean bishop named Paulus Faraj Raho. And Father Paulo was abducted after leading the prayers at the Church of the Holy Spirit in Mosul. And 3 people with him at the time, a driver and 2 guards, were killed by those kidnappers. And the defenseless archbishop was bundled into the trunk of a car, remarkably in the dark, alone for probably the last time until his death. The 65-year-old archbishop managed to get out his last cell phone call. He was determined to deliver a final message to his congregation, instructions that would ensure he would never be released alive. He begged them not to pay any ransom for his life. He knew from bitter experience how futile such payoffs were, because the archbishop had been making those very payments for years. It's not really clear when the archbishop began to hand over the alms he collected at Sunday Mass to the Sunni militant insurgents who menaced his congregation. The details emerged only after his death. The men who had come to him said they were with Al-Qaeda, and they demanded protection money. It's a tax as old as Islam. It's levied on Christians and Jews, but in the modern context of Mosul, it was administered like a mafia shakedown. Archbishop Paulo paid for protection that his community never got. The militants continued to kidnap priests, demanded thousands of dollars in ransom, and victimized the community, even as the Christians of Mosul continued to pay. The payments were financing the militants that were killing the Christians. And Christians were digging into their life savings and sweetening the money pot with thousands more dollars in international donations. The archbishop must have been convinced that if he didn't pay, the violence would have been much worse. Now, even today, the Christians in Mosul are threatened, and leading up to the recent elections, the violence was directed specifically at them, and there was another group of people who went into exile and may not ever come back. The Pope called on the Iraqi government to protect them, but I fear that the Christian community in Iraq will go the way of the Jewish community in Iraq, which is it will dwindle to a point where it won't exist anymore. The Christians of Iraq have actually complained to European governments and asked them to stop taking refugees for resettlement, because they really worry that there's not going to be any of them left. The next subject that I want to talk a little bit about was the one that was for me the hardest to tackle, and that was the subject of prostitution. You see it when you go to Damascus. You know it's happening when you go to Damascus. And the numbers are appalling. Hundreds, maybe thousands of women, Iraqi women, have turned to the sex trade for survival. Now, every war brings prostitution, so it's not a big shock that women do this. But in Damascus, among the Iraqi community, girls as young as 12 were forced into the trade by their parents. These are fathers and mothers who made a deal to live off the proceeds of their daughters. And part of the problem was this. Refugees are officially not permitted to hold jobs. And female-headed households accounted for 1/4 of all the refugees that were in Damascus. They were widowed, they were divorced, and they had children to support. They had no marketable skills. They had come from a conservative society where they hadn't been in the job force. And here they were in exile, and sex was the only thing that they had to sell. It took a long time for me to be able to meet this community and hang out with some of these women to find out how the business went. And I met a woman named Noor. She had 2 kids, one a daughter. And Noor decided that she was going to tell me her life story. And I think in part is that somebody was willing to listen. Somebody was just willing to bear witness for her. It was important for her to tell. And over a year, I would go and see her every time I came back to Damascus. And at some moment, she said, do you want to go with me? Would you be interested in going to a club? And I said, yes, I would, because it's the hardest thing to do. Even the UN protection officials can't do this. It's really difficult to be able to actually see how the business works. So Noor agreed that we would meet one night at midnight, and we would go to the club. And I was a little pressured because I kind of didn't bring my prostitution costume. I don't carry it with me, so I had to do what I could with my gym clothes, but she kind of decided that what I couldn't show in cleavage I could make up in mascara. So point was that I was sort of marched off to the bathroom to apply an Iraqi layer of makeup. Noor was astonishing to me. When I first met her, I saw her in a tracksuit, runny makeup, hair in a ponytail, and when I saw her at midnight, she looked fantastic. Her makeup was perfect, her hair was shiny, she had these big fake fingernails that she sort of had around her very expensive cell phone. And off we went to this club, and I met a lot of women in the bathroom because we were all, over the sink putting our makeup on. And everybody was showing each other the pictures of their kids on their cell phones, because that's what this was all about. They were making money for these kids. And one of them was a journalist. One of them was a woman who had been a television journalist in Baghdad. She worked for the American network, and one day she got in her backyard a little note that said, leave or die with a bullet. And so, there's no court of appeals on one of those. And so she took off, and it was her kids that she was supporting. She turned out to be very helpful to me when I was in the club. We had lunch later, and we talked about what she did for a living. But the part I'm going to read for you now is a moment. I'm there a couple of hours. By this time, everybody in the club's drunk except for me. And I was passed off as a Ukrainian, which would explain why I didn't speak Arabic, because I certainly couldn't speak English there. That would have been dangerous. And so at some moment, I'm in the back of the club, and I have to move. I would have to dance. I was in the dark at the back of the room, and the dance stage seemed like a bright planet, a place so distant I could barely make out the life forms. Noor had left me sitting alone. She was wandering. She was around the club, greeting old friends. She had explained to the group of men sitting behind us that I was Ukrainian and therefore didn't speak Arabic, but that didn't stop them from sending drinks to the table and stop them from trying to engage in drunken conversation. When one kissed me on the top of the head, I decided that the dance stage would be safer than my seat. I climbed up onto the stage into the bright lights. Most of the dancers seemed alone in the crowd. An older woman in a vivid red dress had been on the dance floor all night. She appeared to be listening to music from some distant time inside her head. Eyes closed, she mouthed the lyrics of traditional laments of loss. Her dress was plain and conservative, more appropriate for a day at the market, but with each refrain her eyes moistened, and she took the cigarette she was holding and brought the burning tip close to the exposed skin above her breasts. Over and over she brought the smoldering tobacco near her naked skin, about to inflict pain, but stopping short of contact. When the music stopped, she left the stage for a refresher of tobacco and alcohol. Two girls danced together, fingers locked, madly twirling long, dark, waist-long hair in circles to the beat of the music. I'd seen one of the girls in the ladies' room earlier in the evening. She was dressed in a schoolgirl's outfit. She'd changed into a more revealing costume and had paired herself with another long-haired beauty. Were they a package deal? Did they know each other? They embraced as old friends, but they didn't make eye contact with each other or any other dancer on the stage. Besides them were two little girls, no more than 12 years old, in party dresses with lipstick. They copied the faces of the older women on stage, giddy, shiny-faced, dancing at 3 o'clock in the morning. The undeclared rules of the dance floor segregated the dancers. Men danced with men, arms entwined over shoulders, in short lines, flinging out one leg at a time and moving in a circle. Women danced alone or in pairs, breaking the rules. Men dancing with women would imply a business arrangement, and it was too early in the evening for the pairing to begin. The men mounted the stage to scout, to get a better look at the merchandise on offer. Now I got out of there because my translator, my male translator, had heard that I was going to do this, and sometime in the night up on that dance floor, I saw him dancing. And he winked, and I knew that I was going to get out of there safely. And we walked out, and I forgot where I was, and we began to speak in English. And the Syrians at the door, the way this works is if you walk out with a man, then you pay them a cut. It's, it's about $15, and they were furious with me. They wanted their money. I said, but he's my friend, in English, not good. And they said, if you don't pay, don't ever come back here again. Well, that was an easy thing to do. Okay, fine, no problem. And off we went into the night to compare notes. And what he told me is that as Umnor was on his side of the club, what she was selling in her cell phone were young girls to customers in the place. Umnor was a madam. And she was also a survivor, as most of those women are. The latest government quarterly report, because numbers are always difficult in the Middle East, and so I use U.S. government numbers, tell us that 1.9 million Iraqis are in exile, and there's been no widespread returns. More than 2 million are still displaced. Now, this shifting population is a huge loss to Iraq. It's a problem to the neighbors. It's a tragedy for everybody who's caught up in it. And it's a significant indicator of the future health of Iraq. These people have not, for the most part, sought actual refuge outside of the region. Many of them do not sign up at UNHCR, which suggests that they actually do intend to go home. Only about 10% of this population has signed up to be resettled. So they are waiting for some indication that they are welcome back home. They keep in touch with Iraq in chat rooms, on cell phones. They watch Iraqi television. They live in Iraqi neighborhoods in Damascus and in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Egypt. I argue in this book that there can't be stability in Iraq until these people come home, or until they think that it is their right to come home, that they have a place in Iraq. And that will take political reconciliation. Their families are waiting to find that out. And so is every government in the region. Thank you very much. Questions?
I had a conversation a couple of years ago with an American guy. I'm neither a Christian nor Muslim. My father were Hindu, and I don't consider myself a true Hindu. And I love sausage and bacon. I was talking to an American guy, and during the conversation, we come up with the issue of prostitution and pornography in Arab world. I asked him some of the thing, and he told me I saw a couple of things in a blog and internet, and every time I put out some criticism about the Arab world, he tends to give me the same answer. It's Arab Christian or Lebanese Christian. So like when you go to like Damascus, how do you see like is it obvious like you are in the red light street, or how can you?
Oh, you want an address?
How can you? No. I'm like, how can it be obvious to you like you are in a red light district?
Well, a couple of things about. It's funny that that someone would say, "Okay, Muslims would never have pornography. That must be the Christians who are doing that," which just shows that Muslims are as hypocritical as everybody else on the planet, because nobody likes to own the idea that pornography and prostitution are the oldest professions. In fact, if you think about it, it's named in Babylon. It's named in Iraq. The Whore of Babylon is part of sort of the epic myths of our humanity. How you know is because people tell you. You spend enough time in that refugee community, and I didn't go to one club. I went to many clubs. The club that I wrote about was one that I got into in a way that I could experience it for myself. I'd been to plenty of clubs where I would get my translator and we'd go like, the problem was I was a woman, and so it was odd for me to be, even with a date, we would go to these clubs around the ring of Damascus, and what you would see is, the women, these were really sleazy clubs, the women would hold hands and essentially walk in a circle, and there would be all men, and the girls would come and talk to them and then go back up on the stage and dance, and none of the business part of this doesn't happen until about 4 o'clock in the morning. You kind of know what's happening when you're in a situation like that, but it was just too odd for me to be there. So I eventually had to abandon going with a date, and I had to go with another woman. That was the only way I was going to be able to stay there and watch it all the way through the night. But you don't need subtitles to figure out what's going on in these places. And all the refugees know exactly which club is for which thing. If you want to make the deal directly with a woman, you go to the club that I was in. If you want to deal with what would essentially be a pimp, you go to the ones I was talking about earlier, where I went as a date. But there's plenty of possibilities in these places.
Well, like the Muslim, they don't like to have any stigma attached to like their culture. That's what I perceive like when I talk to him. American, he every time I talk about the bad thing, he's just scapegoat into like a Western culture, or to Arab Christian or Lebanese Christian.
Not a surprise. Not a surprise. Any other questions? Yep.
Are you still based there? I mean, you're here on a book tour now, but are you still based there?
I never was based there, and nobody is. Almost
still living out of a hotel?
All the reporters who are there come in and out. There's nobody that is there all the time. And in the past couple of years, we were in a shared house with the Washington Post. Actually, what would have been a mansion in the old days, but we needed a place that big because you have drivers, and you need them 24 hours a day. You have translators, and you need enough bedrooms because sometimes it's too dangerous for people to go back to their homes. It's gotten a little better, and that house was outside of a big hotel. That was another place that journalists stayed, the Hummer Hotel, and the whole compound was surrounded by walls. Now, sometime this fall, that whole the house was blown up. That particular part of Baghdad, it's called Jedriya, and it's a pretty upscale neighborhood, was hit. And part of the reason I think it got hit was, Al-Qaeda is never very subtle about what their messages are, and this message was, you can't protect foreigners who come here, Iraqi government. And so now we are actually in a compound shared, I think, with McClatchy and Washington Post again, and it's in one of the politicians' big compounds. So we have our own security, and then we have government security. But people come in and out all the time. It's the only way that you can really survive it. It's very, very, very wearing. to do it. It's not like you get to go out to the movies on Friday night.
Are in the refugee camps, are they as singularly focused, like the Sunnis are just with the Sunnis in the refugee camps, and are mixed marriages in there? I mean, is there any of the old Iraq in the refugee camps?
You know what? There's no refugee camps. It's
Well,
not
neighborhoods.
It's neighborhoods, and you know what happened is all these Arab governments didn't recognize the 1951 Refugee Convention from the UN, and they didn't because by 1951 the Palestinians had already arrived, and you know they were promised that these people would be going home soon, and of course they never did, and we're now how many years later, and you know there are still Palestinian refugees in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, and so they weren't going to play that game again. So they don't recognize the 1951 convention, and what that means is when you cross that border as a refugee, you have all the rights and privileges of a tourist, just like I do. I can't work, they can't work. You can go to UNHCR and you can get a piece of paper that says that you now qualify for resettlement, and you get some protection with that piece of paper, but not a whole lot. Now, the good news, I suppose you could say, is that everybody could rent an apartment where they wanted, where they could afford. Sometimes 20 people would live in one of those apartments because you didn't know how long you're going to have to make that money stretch. And it did turn out that there were sectarian neighborhoods, more because the Shiites tended to live in a place called Sayyidah Zainab, and the reason they lived down there is because that's a big, big shrine for Shia. And the Sunnis lived in a place called Jaramana, but there was Christians there as well. So it didn't really break down completely into sectarian parts of either Jordan or Damascus, although at some moment the Jordanians actually barred Shias from entering. They closed their borders to Shias. No, thank you, we don't want any. When I was there in December, I met two guys, and I swear they were hilariously funny because they were the odd couple. One was a Sunni. He'd been an oud player, and his dad had made these beautiful ouds out of old distressed wood, and he was still doing that. And his pal, the painter, was a Shia, and the two of them were living in this apartment in Damascus, and they both had the same worries and complaints. Could they go home? Could they not? Would they vote in the elections? Would they not? So a lot of that stuff gets dropped as soon as people cross the border, because these are all identity questions that are almost like on a dial. When your community collapses and there's no police, and you're terrified to send your kid to school, and you don't know who to turn to for protection, people tend to fall back on these identities. I think Americans would do it too. If you think about, who am I? How do you define yourself? If all of a sudden overnight, you had to survive, you would somehow come together with like-minded people and see if you could make it. And that's essentially what happened in Iraq. So as soon as the state comes back and you know how it's going to work, then you forget it. But what they have done in Damascus is they've created little Baghdads. So in both of these neighborhoods, in the surrounding ones outside of the capital, there's Iraqi restaurants everywhere. Jordan too. And you'd think that, we're talking lamb, tomatoes, and onions, that they could find that in Syria and they wouldn't have to open their own restaurants. It'd be everywhere. But they tell you, and I have come to be able to taste it, there is a difference between the way the Iraqis do it and the way the Syrians do it. And for a long time, when the caravans of refugees would be, driving hell-bent out of Baghdad, the drivers were bringing up spices from the old Baghdad markets, because the restaurants all said, "Oh, we have to have those spices. If we don't, Iraqis will know." And there's another delicacy that Iraqis eat that Syrians don't, and it's called maskouf. And it's a particular way that it can be a carp, it's a whitefish, and you slice it so that you can fan it, and then it's put on sticks, and it's put, in front of a fire, and there's a whole art form in how you smoke the fish and how long it takes, blah, blah, blah. And the Iraqis always argued, we have to have this fish from the Tigris. You can't have these farm crappy fishes from Damascus. Until the taste of the fish was so tainted because of all the dead bodies in the Tigris River, and they finally said, okay, we'll take the farm ones, and they did. Anybody else?
What's the difference between Shias and the Sunnis, culturally or religiously?
It is a religious divide, and the Middle East experts can tell me exactly what year it happens. But it happens in Kufa, in a town in Iraq. It's a fight between the caliph in Damascus and the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. And the argument is actually over who should rule the Muslims. Is it the best guy, the most powerful guy, or is it going to be a bloodline question? And the Shias felt, well, they weren't called Shias then, that they essentially, it's the partisans of Ali is what Shias mean. And they felt it should be a bloodline, and they were willing to try to fight about it, and they lost. And the Sunnis have been dominant ever since because they lost that battle. So that's the moment when the divide comes, and from that moment forward, you can argue that Shias have always felt that you never trust the rulers because it's not the right guy, and so they have been this aggrieved majority wherever they are. I remember a Newsweek lady called me very early on in this book process, and she'd written a piece in Newsweek about an argument here at Harvard about whether you should know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia before you graduated from Harvard. And that was a debate here, actually. And you probably should. You probably should know what that's all about.
Can they tell each other?
You can't. You can't. But visually you cannot. However, you can tell by names. If your name is Omar, it's very unlikely that you are Shiite because you're named after one of the first 4 caliphs after Muhammad. And the Shiites don't like those guys, that guy in particular, Omar. He's a very Sunni, he's a Sunni hero. If your name is Ali, you're more likely to be Shia. And it just has to do with, religious symbolism and, Catholics tend to be called Mary, and culturally you might know that. In Iraq, believe me, they do know, and they can tell by looking at your identity card what you are, because it has to do with what town you're from. If you come from the south, what your dad's name is. There are ways to tell, but there's even a difference in the way you pray. But they're all little things, this as opposed to that in a particular moment in the prayer. On Iraqi television, because it is a predominantly Shiite government, all 5 calls to prayer on state television were, until about 6 months ago, the Shia version, which is the difference of one line. It's, the difference between how Catholics say the Lord's Prayer and Protestants say the Lord's Prayer. There's one extra line at the bottom. It's kind of like that. It's one line, and it talks about the Prophet's family at that moment. If you're a Sunni or a Shiite, you hear that, you know it when you hear it, and so it is galling for for Sunnis in Baghdad that all 5 prayers for a long time on state television were all Shia. Can't we have one? And the Saudis actually intervened and asked them, come on, you could have one Sunni prayer, and so they did it at noon. And now, 1 out of the 5 is in the middle of the day. Anybody else? Yeah.
So how does reconciliation come about?
That's the $64 million
Yes,
question,
it is.
isn't it? Isn't it? I don't know. I hope that the election this time gets us there. That this election has been different than any others. That Iyad Alawi is a Shiite, but he is the standard bearer for the Sunnis who believe that you might be able to do this through the electoral process, and they didn't waste their votes on any of the Sunni Islamist parties. They voted for the, even if they believed in that, they voted for the guy who talked about we're going to be a secular, not secular, what's Almani? It is secular. Sorry, I got confused with sectarian. We're going to be a secular party. We're not going to talk about Sunnis and Shiites. We're going to offer a nationalist vision. And he got votes from Shiites and Sunnis. That's the only way that you can explain that he did better than anybody else. He got 89 I forget the numbers, but it's a slim plurality.
91?
91
91
and 89.
and 89. He beats Maliki by 2.
Right.
And it's a vision that was surprising to bring a victory to Alawi. I don't think anybody predicted before the elections. And there are people like, if I get too technical, please forgive me, but the Sadrists are now talking about, there's no way we can have a government without Alawi's people. This is nationalist talk. That's good. That's healthy. All the refugees are watching this. If Sunnis get positions as the defense minister, the interior minister, the Kurds want the oil ministry, no surprise there. That's where the bucks are. Then people will think about that there may be some openings, that there may be a change. This stuff is so culturally linked when you think about it. I remember hearing a story from a Sunni who said, here's why I can't go back there. In the old days, when I'd go get my license changed, everybody was a Sunni in there. And so I could cut in line if I needed to because my tribal guys were up there. But now I go in there and they're all Shiites. I have no one to talk to. I have no way to cut in line. Now, the old way was bad. The new way is bad. And so what you need is a bit of both. You need some mix, that it's not all one thing or the other thing. It shouldn't happen in the Middle East that majority rules over minority with no recourse, or vice versa. And if I were king of the world, I'd say to the Iraqis, why don't you ask the Saudis how they treat their Shiite minority? They don't like you very much, but why don't you ask that question? Why don't you open that discussion across the region? Because this shouldn't be a one-way street. But I don't think that's going to happen. So maybe let's watch what happens as this the negotiations over this election proceeds. We probably have a couple of months, and it may work. If it doesn't, Iraq's in for big trouble. If it doesn't, because there's not an election for another 5 years, and Al Qaeda has figured out that they can really work that wedge issue. That's what they did all last week in the 3 attacks. They were very, very, very pointed, very clever. They took intelligence, they took resources, they got away with it cleanly all 3 times. And if that's where we're headed in Iraq, we are in big, big, big trouble. It is 7:04. If you want to ask another question, I'd be happy to answer it, but it's 7:04, and if you would like to get up and then I thank you very much.